The wind howled through the barren trees as dusk settled over the small town of Ellison Grove. It was the first day of October, and the air carried an eerie chill, despite the unseasonably warm weather. The leaves, dry and brittle, whispered across the streets like skeletal hands reaching for the living. In the distance, a dense fog crept down the hills, swallowing the town in an unsettling silence. People began to shutter their windows early, as if an unspoken dread hung in the air. For some, it was the start of the fall season. Pumpkins to carve, festivals to attend, but for others it was a time to stay inside, to avoid the creeping feeling that something was terribly wrong. It started with the old manor on the edge of town, abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. Its windows stared out like hollow eyes, empty and lifeless. But this year something was different. Lights flickered in the upstairs rooms. Shapes could be seen moving behind the curtains, though no one dared approach. Those who had ventured near the estate before claimed the air felt colder near it, as if the house itself exhaled an unnatural frost. Even the bravest souls who had tried to explore its haunted halls never came back the same. They spoke of whispers in the walls, of eyes watching them from hidden corners, of something hungry lurking just out of sight. No one knew exactly when the town had begun to change, but this year the shift was undeniable. Strange occurrences escalated as the days shortened, each passing night more unsettling than the last. Dogs howled at nothing in particular, their eyes wide and unblinking, staring at empty corners. Children spoke of things they had seen in the woods, shadows that didn't belong to any creature known to man. Some townsfolk started missing. First 1 or 2, then more, until the list seemed to grow each day. They never left any trace, no sign of struggle. It was as if they simply vanished into the air. As Halloween approached, the town grew quieter. People kept to their homes, doors locked tight, eyes glancing nervously over their shoulders. The air had turned thick with dread, and no one could explain why. The local tavern, usually bustling with laughter and stories, was eerily empty. The few who dared enter spoke in hushed tones, their eyes constantly darting to the corners of the room, as if waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. The lights flickered more often now, and the steady thrum of the town's heartbeat. The constant chatter of life seemed to fall away, leaving only an oppressive silence. Ho-ha! Then, on the night of the harvest moon, something unimaginable happened. The town's church bell rang out at midnight, but it was not the usual sound. It was a deep, hollow clang, like the tolling of a bell from another world. Those who heard it said the sound reverberated through their bones, shaking them from the inside out. The sky above had turned a sickly shade of green, as if the heavens themselves were being consumed by something malevolent. No one dared leave their homes after that, not even to check on neighbours. And still, as the days dragged on, the disappearances continued. The fog grew thicker, creeping through the streets like a living thing, swallowing houses whole. The trees began to bend and twist unnaturally, their branches reaching out like claws, grasping for anyone who dared pass too close. The sound of crunching leaves beneath unseen feet echoed at odd hours of the night. It was then that the town's remaining residents understood it wasn't just the fall season that had changed. Something ancient, something dark, had awakened with the turning of the leaves. The autumn air was now filled with the scent of decay and death, and whatever force had taken root in Ellison Grove was not finished yet. One by one, the final people disappeared. Some were found, but only in pieces, shredded clothes, remnants of blood in the streets, strange markings on the ground that no one could decipher. The others, they were never found at all. No footprints, no signs of struggle. It was as if they had been erased from the world, swallowed whole by the very land they had called home. On the last day of the season, as the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, the town of Ellison Grove was empty, silent. The only thing left behind was the ominous fog, still creeping through the empty streets, like a haunting reminder of what had once been. The manor on the hill stood as it always had, empty, but not abandoned. The lighthouse flickered again in the upper windows, as if waiting for something or someone to return. The snow fell heavier as the days stretched on, blanketing Ellison Grove in a heavy, unnatural quiet. The fog, though thinner now, still clung to the corners of the streets and curled around the skeletal trees like some living thing breathing in the shadows. No birds chirped, no dogs barked, no footsteps left impressions in the fresh powder. It was as if time itself had frozen, held captive by something ancient and insidious. No one had dared venture back into the town since the last of the residents had vanished. The few who had attempted to return, curious souls, or those hoping to reclaim lost loved ones, found the town's borders thick with that unnatural fog. They spoke of an overwhelming pressure on their chests, as if the land itself was pushing against them, trying to keep them away. The manor on the hill, however, was a different story. Despite its isolation, despite its strange history, the house seemed to beckon. The once quiet, decaying structure now stood like a monument to the unknown, its upper windows glowing faintly through the mist, as if inviting anyone daring enough to uncover its secrets. 2 weeks after the last person vanished, a figure arrived in Ellison Grove. A man, his face gaunt and drawn with exhaustion, walking slowly through the snow. He was no stranger to the town. In fact, he had been a local for many years, though he had long since left. He hadn't planned to return, but something, a vision, a whisper, a force he could neither deny nor explain, had drawn him back. The man, known only as David to those who still remembered him, walked toward the town's centre with a grim determination. His breath came in visible plumes, the air so cold it stung. His boots crunched through the snow, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. He had heard the stories, of course, of the disappearances, of the strange happenings that had plagued the town, but he had never believed them. It was always too easy to dismiss such things as superstition, as fear spreading like wildfire among the frightened. Until now. David's eyes lifted to the manor on the hill, a dark, foreboding silhouette against the bleak sky. He had to go there. There was no logical explanation for it, but he knew that was where the answers lay. His feet moved on their own, and soon the town was behind him, swallowed by the fog. As he made his way up the winding path to the manor, the temperature dropped and an oppressive silence settled over him. The trees surrounding the house seemed to lean inward, their branches like gnarled fingers reaching for his throat. He reached the front door, its wood warped and splintered by years of neglect, and knocked. 3 short raps, hesitant but firm. The door creaked open slowly, though David could not remember hearing it move. The air inside was thick, charged with something ancient and malignant. The house smelled of decay, of dust, of forgotten things. The faint light flickering from the upper windows grew brighter with each passing moment, as though the house itself were alive, breathing. Stepping inside, David was hit with an overwhelming sense of wrongness. The walls seemed to pulse faintly, and the shadows, dark and deep, clinging to corners, pooling under furniture, seemed to shift with a life of their own. He called out, his voice barely a whisper against the thundering silence. "Hello? Is anyone here?" A chill ran down his spine when he received no answer, but just as he was about to turn back, a whisper, like the rustle of dry leaves, filled the air. It came from above. The stairs, the whisper seemed to beckon him. Unable to resist, David climbed the staircase, his hand gripping the banister as though it might crumble beneath his touch. The upstairs hallway stretched before him, dimly lit, with doors lining each side, each one slightly ajar, as if waiting for him to enter. The whispering grew louder, clearer, a low murmur like a chant, though the words were indecipherable. He reached the first door. It swung open with an unsettling creak. Inside, the room was empty, but the air felt heavy, oppressive, like it was holding its breath. The floor was littered with torn, yellowed pages of old books, all written in a language David could not understand. He stepped forward, drawn toward the far corner, where a faint glow pulsed from a large, ornate mirror. As he approached it, he saw the reflection of the room as it was, but not. The colours were off, twisted, as if the reflection was seen through water or fog. And then he saw it. A figure standing in the mirror behind him, watching him, a woman dressed in tattered, blood-stained clothes, her hair hanging in matted strands over her face. Her eyes, hollow black pits, stared straight into his soul. David spun around, heart hammering in his chest, but there was no one there. He breathed hard, his breath coming in sharp gasps, but the room was empty. The mirror, however, remained unchanged. The woman still stood there, her mouth now moving, her lips curling into a slow, mocking smile. "Leave before it takes you to." The words were soft, almost a sigh, but they hit David like a slap. His legs trembled beneath him, and before he could move, a low rumble shook the house. The floor beneath him seemed to shift, as though the ground itself was waking, groaning in pain. He spun toward the door, but it slammed shut with a deafening crash. The whispering grew louder, a chorus now, as if 100 voices were chanting in unison, their words lost in the cacophony. David ran, desperate to escape the suffocating grip of the house, but as he reached the stairs, he heard it. The sound of something following him, footsteps behind him, echoing in the dark. When he glanced back, he saw nothing, but the air seemed to vibrate with an unseen presence, as though the house itself was closing in on him. The door to the outside stood before him now, but as his hand touched the handle, it twisted. The house groaned, and a deep, guttural voice rumbled from the walls. "You cannot leave. You belong here." Aha! David pulled the door open with all his strength, the cold night air rushing in like a wave. He stumbled outside, falling to the ground, gasping for breath. But the fog, it was thickening again, swirling around him, like something alive, whispering in a language he could no longer understand. And in the distance, above the manor, a light flickered in the upper window. A figure stood there, watching, waiting. As David looked back toward the house, he realized that Ellison Grove had not been abandoned. It had chosen him, and it would never let him go. David's pulse thundered in his ears as he scrambled to his feet, his hands shaking from both the cold and the horror that was now consuming him. The fog closed in, wrapping around him like a suffocating cloak, muting the world beyond the manor. He could still hear it, the whispers. 1,000 voices blending together, rising like a wave pressing against his skin. His heart pounded harder with each step he took, but no matter how fast he moved, it felt as though the fog was pulling him back, dragging him toward the house. He stumbled backward, his boots slipping on the icy ground as he tried to make sense of what was happening. The manor's silhouette loomed over him like a predator watching its prey. The windows flickered again, this time more violently, as if the house itself was trying to signal to him. The door behind him rattled, and for a moment it sounded like something, or someone, was pounding against it, from the inside, begging to be let out. David turned and ran, not caring anymore whether he understood what was happening. His mind overwhelmed by the vision of that woman in the mirror. The voice that had told him to leave barely functioned. All that mattered now was escaping. He bolted down the path, fighting the biting wind, but the fog, it was following him. The mist clung to his legs, pulling him back like cold, skeletal hands. He could feel the weight of it pressing against him, holding him in place, each step becoming harder, each breath more laboured. He spun around, his breath visible in the air, trying to shake off the creeping dread. The manor was still there, its silhouette barely visible through the thinning fog. But there, standing at the threshold of the house, was the woman. The same tattered figure, her eyes hollow, her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. She didn't move, but David could feel the eyes on him, boring into him like twin points of fire. She was calling to him. No, the house was calling to him. "You're not free," the voice echoed, not from the woman, but from the house itself, the walls, the very earth beneath him. The words didn't make sense, and yet they did, filling him with an overwhelming certainty. His knees buckled, the snow beneath him giving way as if the ground itself was trying to swallow him whole. He reached out for support, but there was nothing to hold on to. The fog thickened further, now swirling in tight spirals around him, drawing him back toward the manor. It was no longer a matter of choice. His body moved on its own, dragged by some invisible force. His legs were no longer his own, his willpower rendered useless by the growing pressure in the air, the weight of the fog that twisted and pulled at him like vines. The whispering was everywhere now. It was in his ears, under his skin, inside his thoughts. Words and names he could not comprehend, ancient phrases that twisted his mind. They wrapped around him like a noose, squeezing tighter with every breath, every heartbeat. And through it all, one thought echoed in the darkness. It has found you. David reached the base of the stairs before he even realized he had moved, the doors of the manor swinging open as if they had never been closed. His heart raced as he stumbled forward, the world blurring around him. The house wanted him back, and there was no escaping that truth now. Inside, the air grew impossibly cold, the walls now visibly pulsing with a sickly greenish light. The shadows thickened, becoming more solid, more tangible. Something was inside those shadows, something that waited for him, something that had waited for all of them. As David stepped into the foyer, the doors slammed shut behind him with a deafening crack, the sound reverberating through the house like a death knell. The whispering stopped, dead silence. And then, with terrifying clarity, he heard a voice, low and dripping with malice. "You should never have come back, David." It wasn't the woman this time. The voice was deeper, older, almost familiar. And as David turned toward the staircase, he realized what it was. It was the house itself, speaking to him. The walls, the floors, the very air around him, all of it was alive. The staircase loomed before him, the shadows gathering like a storm. Something moved in the darkness. Something large, something ancient. It was breathing, exhaling a foul, sickly vapour that filled the room, pressing against his lungs, making it hard to breathe. "You're a part of us now," the voice continued, the sound reverberating in his bones, heavy and suffocating. "Once you enter, you can never leave. We are one." David's stomach churned, his body frozen in place, unable to move, unable to scream. The shadows at the top of the stairs shifted, forming into shapes, figures, faces, twisted and grotesque. Their eyes locked on him, their mouths stretched into silent, toothless grins. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. The mirror. The same mirror from the room above. The faint light pulsed from it, beckoning him. But it wasn't just a mirror. It was a doorway. The reflections were not his own. They were the faces of the missing townsfolk, their eyes hollow, their bodies twisted and broken. They stood behind him, their mouths moving, their voices melding into one. "Come closer, David. We've been waiting for you." The floor trembled beneath him, the house groaning, as if alive, as if it were breathing him in. And slowly, ever so slowly, David began to understand the truth. This wasn't a house. It was a prison. And he was its prisoner. With one final desperate breath, David turned and ran. But the door to the outside had vanished. The walls had closed in, the house shifting like a living thing. The shadows enveloped him, and the whispers filled his mind. Their whispers like 1,000 chains wrapping around his soul. "You belong to us now," the voice whispered again, the echo endless. David screamed, but it was lost in the suffocating darkness, swallowed whole by the manor that had never been abandoned, only waiting. And somewhere, deep within the house, the woman's twisted grin reappeared in the mirror, waiting for the next soul to arrive. The house was closing in around David, its dark embrace tightening with every passing second. His breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air thick with the smell of rot and decay. The shadows swirled like hungry tendrils, pulling him deeper into the heart of the manor. His legs felt like lead, as though the floor beneath him had turned to quicksand, dragging him down into its depth. His mind was fractured, torn between the suffocating terror and the haunting whisper that wrapped around his thoughts. "You cannot escape," the voice echoed again, louder now, as if the walls themselves were speaking to him. "You belong to us." David's eyes darted around the room, wild, desperate for any exit, but there was none. The mirror in the corner flickered, its surface rippling like water disturbed by a stone. The reflection in it shifted, showing him not the room, but a twisted, decayed version of Ellison Grove. The streets were empty, the houses dark and hollow, and the trees, twisted, gnarled, with faces carved into their bark, watching him. And there, at the centre of it all, stood the manor, its silhouette towering like a living thing, breathing and waiting. Behind him, the shadows seemed to pulse, alive and hungry, their forms twisting into monstrous shapes. Faces, ghastly and contorted, emerged from the darkness, their hollow eyes filled with a cold, infinite hunger. They whispered his name, their voices overlapping, maddened. "David, David, come home." The mirror flickered again, and this time, something reached out from within it. A hand, fleshless and pale, gripped the glass, its fingers cracking and stretching as if it had been trapped for eons. Slowly, the rest of the figure emerged, and David's heart stopped in his chest. It was the woman, the one from the mirror, but now she was not a mere reflection. She was real. Her skin was rotting, her face a grotesque mask of decay, but her eyes, those black, empty pits, still burned with that same unholy hunger. She stepped out of the mirror, her mouth opening to reveal rows of jagged, broken teeth. "You are ours now," she rasped, her voice a sickly gurgle, as if she had been drowning for centuries. She reached toward him, her skeletal fingers outstretched. David stumbled back, his heart pounding, but his legs refused to move. He was frozen in place, unable to tear his gaze away from the woman, from the hellish figures now filling the room. Her lips twisted into a grin, her jagged teeth scraping together in anticipation. "You're going to join us," she hissed, stepping closer. The whispers grew louder, the walls themselves seeming to tighten around him. And then, as if the very air was thickening with their malice, the ground beneath David cracked open, a black chasm appearing at his feet, swallowing the floorboards, the shadows creeping toward him, eager for their prize. David's chest tightened, and a scream built in his throat, but before he could release it, the woman's hand reached his chest. Cold, unnaturally cold, it pressed against him, sending a shockwave through his body. His skin burned, his breath coming in painful gasps, as though the very life force was being ripped from him. His knees buckled, but the woman's grip remained tight, pulling him forward, drawing him deeper into the void. "You're one of us now," she whispered again, her lips curling in that same twisted, mocking smile. David's vision blurred, his limbs going numb. He could feel his body fading, his essence being consumed by the house, by the darkness, by the cold that had claimed this place. He tried to fight it, tried to scream, to run, but there was nowhere to go. And then, just as his body seemed to dissolve into the shadows, the whispers stopped. The house went silent. The woman, the figures, the horrors, they all paused. For a brief, fleeting moment, there was stillness. David's vision cleared, and he saw them. The missing townsfolk, their forms twisted and broken, their faces vacant and void of expression. They surrounded him now, their eyes empty, their bodies decaying, as if they had been here forever. They were no longer human, no longer alive. They were the house's prisoners, bound to it for eternity, and David understood now. They had never left, because they had never escaped. The house did not claim their bodies, it claimed their souls. David felt himself slip away from his body, his mind unraveling like thread from a spool. He saw the town, his town, as it was, and as it would always be. No one would remember him, no one would find him. Ellison's Grove had consumed them all, one by one, until nothing remained but the house, standing empty and alive, waiting for the next soul to wander too close. And as the cold took him, David felt himself drawn toward the mirror once more. His own reflection stared back at him, hollow-eyed, broken, twisted. He saw the woman smile at him from the other side. Welcome home. The last thing David felt before the darkness fully claimed him was the suffocating, eternal cold of the house closing around him.